Assalamu alaikum and good evening, everybody. I am John Woodhouse. I am the chair of South London Interfaith Group. South London Interfaith Group is celebrating 40 years anniversary this year, and we're going to do that by planting trees, and we're going to digitize our archives and look backwards and also look forwards. As you said already, this for 30 years, the annual Iftar near the end of the holy month of Ramadan has been a very special event in our year. And this is the second year it has had to be virtual, but we look forward to returning to Hyderi Mosque next year. I request that everybody stay on mute as we are recording the session. If you do not want to be seen on screen, please turn off your video. The chat will be disabled, but once the speakers have finished, it will reopen for you to post your questions, and please indicate which speakers you would like to answer your questions. I will briefly introduce each of our distinguished speakers in turn, and we are most grateful to them for giving us their time. Each will speak for 15 minutes, and I have my bells ready. Just as a warning, if it looks like you are going to overrun. I would like to draw your attention to these books. Fratelli Tutti is a definite follow-up to the document we're talking about tonight, and I would strongly recommend reading it. And I think Let Us Dream has become really popular. It's mentioned so much now, so I thoroughly recommend it to you. And the document we're talking about tonight, of course, is Human Fraternity for World Peace and Living Together. So we're going to start with a text from the Quran, which I believe Sajid is going to read for us.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيها الناس إنا خلقناكم من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا إن أكرمكم عند الله أتقاكم إن الله عليم خبير. O people, verily we have created you from a male and a female and made you into nations and tribes so that you may recognize each other. Verily, the most honored amongst you in the eyes of God is one who safeguards himself against evil with full awareness of divine laws. Verily, God is all-knowing, all-aware. ليس البر أن تولوا وجوهكم قبل المشرق والمغرب ولكن البر من آمن بالله واليوم الآخر والملائكة والكتاب والنبيين وآتى المال على حبه ذي القربى واليتامى والمساكين وابن السبيل والسائلين وفي الرقاب وأقام الصلاة وآتى الزكاة والموفون بعهدهم إذا عاهدوا والصابرين في البأساء والضراء وحين البعث أولئك الذين صدقوا وأولئك هم المتقون. It is not righteousness that you turn your faces towards the east or the west, but righteousness is this, that one should believe in Allah and the last day, and the angels and the book and the prophets, and give away wealth out of love for him to the kindred and the orphans and the poor and the wayfarer and the needy, and for the freeing of the slaves, and establish the prayer and pay the poor rate, and those who fulfill their promise when they make a promise, and the patient ones in distress and affliction, and in time of conflict. These are they who are true to themselves, and these are they who safeguard themselves with full awareness of divine laws. وعباد الرحمن الذين يمشون على الأرض حونا وإذا خاطبهم الجاهلون قالوا سلاما. The servants of God are those who walk with humility on the earth, and when the ignorant address them, they say peace. صدق الله العلي العظيم. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. Thank you for listening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you very much. One problem I have is because I'm sharing screen, I can't see anybody. But I just want to share one quote which struck me very much. It was something that Pope Francis said on the plane returning from Iraq. You are human, you are a child of God, you are my brother and sister. And I think that is almost like the central message of the document that we're thinking about tonight. It's a great pleasure to welcome Julie. I haven't actually spoken with you yet, Julie. It's great that you're here. Julie Siddiqui, MBE, is a mentor, consultant and gender equality campaigner with a specific focus on Jewish, Muslim and other interfaith relations, and on applying that to social action work together. She has a background in community grassroots work spanning 25 years. Julie has recently established Together We Thrive, a network and online platform to train and inspire Muslim women to fully participate in society at every level, to challenge patriarchal attitudes in all communities, and to ensure Muslim women are better represented in print and TV media. She is co-founder of Open My Mosque, a campaign to highlight and speak out about inequalities in UK mosques, and to find ways to address these needs through policy change and innovative storytelling. Julie, we welcome you and we hand over to you.
Thank you so much, John. I'm a little bit scared of your bell, and anyone who knows me knows that I talk a lot, so I'm a little bit, but I'm hoping I did a trial run earlier and I'm fine. I think I'm just within the 15 minutes, so inshallah we should be fine. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. I begin in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. Thank you so much for Rizwan and John and all of the other interfaith group people. Wow, 40 years is really quite impressive and quite humbling, and I really thank everyone else for being here on another Zoom meeting. But I hope this is really fulfilling, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from the other speakers as well. So as John mentioned, we're really here gathering around this document that I would urge everyone to read if you haven't read it. I've been reading it and also reading around it and having a think about some of the things that come from it. One of the parts of the document, it actually says, in the name of God, both communities declare. So this is the people that signed the document on behalf of really both communities, the Catholic Church and also Sunni Muslims, I guess you could say. And it talks about these three principles: the adoption of a culture of dialogue as the path, mutual cooperation as the code of conduct, and reciprocal understanding as the method and standard. And of course, a document like this and the symbolism of it and the signing of it in 2019 is very important and very useful. And what I want to do today is put forward perhaps some ideas that take the document also into something more practical, or something that we can all sort of play a part in, because in a way this document, the signing of it, was symbolizing all of us then taking it forward. You know, they can't do that for us, we have to do that for ourselves. And the word dialogue is mentioned a number of times in the document, and again, a very important word, and lots of people do very important work around dialogue. But I'd like to think about how we can take these things into action and doing things together and not just talking about it. So I'm going to talk about 3 initiatives today that hopefully will pull out some of what I think are important and hopefully will stimulate some ideas and thoughts that we can have in as part of the discussion and Q&A at the end. So the 3 initiatives I'm going to talk about: the Big Iftar, Nisa Nashim, the Jewish and Muslim Women's Network that I co-founded, and Together We Thrive, as John has mentioned earlier.
So I thought maybe that's the same.
Where is that?
Can't let them out on their own.
I can't get back to the...
So starting with the Big Iftar then, the Big Iftar was something that we started 9 years ago. And if you remember 9 years ago, the excitement of the Olympics was there. It was really a time when people were talking a lot about people coming from all over the world, lots of community cohesion. Sorry, can I just ask people to put their things on mute, because I'm getting a bit worried and distracted.
Julie, could you unmute and talk, please?
Yeah, fine. You muted me as well. Okay, I get the message. So we, at that time of the Olympics, you know, we were all thinking about community cohesion and people coming from all over the world. And there were a group of us as Muslims that really felt that one of the messages that we wanted to actually get across to Muslims was really about Ramadan, because it was Ramadan at that time as well. And really saying to Muslims, look, open up Ramadan more. You know, Ramadan is the most blessed time of the year for us as Muslims. And so often it's really Muslim to Muslim. And we were saying, look, open it up more and share the blessings with others. And that's what happened. And it seems so obvious now, but honestly, even 9 years ago, it wasn't really anywhere near as common as it is now. The name, the Big Iftar, came from the idea that if we all do something, it will be a big iftar. So not all of the events had to be big, but they all formed part of this movement. That is how we saw it. And what has been amazing and what I wanted to pull out from it is really the response from other faith communities who ended up in the way that I never, ever could have imagined, actually hosting iftars, hosting Muslims. Iftar, for those who don't know, is the meal that we have when we break our fast. I'll give you a couple of examples to illustrate why it's been so amazing. One is from Coventry Cathedral. Right back then, the Dean of Coventry Cathedral, John Whitcomb, and I were part of an interfaith leadership program together. And through that program, we had developed a friendship and a trust. And I was talking about the Big Iftar idea at one of our programs. And John came to me, obviously getting very excited, and said, I'd love to do it in Coventry Cathedral, which of course I was blown away by, and it was amazing. The thing is that Ramadan was 6 weeks after that. And so anybody who knows anything about cathedral diaries will know that to propose something like that for 6 weeks' time was really kind of unheard of. And I think poor John's staff, when he went back to them and said, look, we have to make this happen, really thought that he, I think, lost the plot. But, you know, through him, his leadership, and also the amazing staff at the cathedral, they did pull it off. And 6 weeks later, we were in Cathedral, and anyone who's been there will know it's a fantastic space. And we were right in the heart of that beautiful space, breaking our fast with people, Muslims and people from other backgrounds in that space, the call to prayer, the hospitality, the love, the beautiful food that we had. And of course, it took leadership. It took, you know, someone like John to make it happen, because of course, understandably, there were people in that community, Christians, people who belong to that cathedral, who love it, who found the whole idea of what he was proposing really difficult to comprehend. And how do you create a space for Muslims to pray in a cathedral where really it isn't something that's ever really been done before in that way? They did it, they pulled it off. It was the most fantastic event. I'll never forget it. Another example was A-List North London, who also hosted an iftar, and they just recently, last week, had their 8th annual iftar, although we had to do it online. And again, from friendship and trust from Rabbi Mark at the time, and Rabbi Morris and myself discussing it. And I'll never forget the care and attention that they put in right from day one to make sure they got it right. You know, imagine a synagogue iftar in North London, you know, is really something amazing. And I think what's important to understand about both of these things is they broke new ground. They gave other places of worship, other people, really a sense that this was something possible and doable and acceptable. And we've had, you know, iftars in all sorts of places, Lambeth Palace and primary schools and out in town squares and all sorts of amazing places since then. But I think, you know, there's something really important to remember there about taking action and leadership and doing things differently. And sometimes you have to push the boundary, your own out of your own comfort zone, perhaps, to do some of this work, which becomes really, really important when you think about the landscape and going beyond, as I said earlier, not just dialogue. So the next initiative I'll talk about, Nisan Nashim, launched it in 2015, following conversations between myself and Laura Marks, who we ended up becoming the co-founders of Nisan Nashim, and also Marcy and others at the time, who we really felt that as women from Jewish and Muslim backgrounds, there was something perhaps that we could just do differently when it comes to these communities. And I had been working with people and friends from the Jewish community for about 5 years already, and really developing these relationships and conversations and thinking about, you know, the relations between these two communities in this country so often become caught up in what is happening in Israel and Palestine, and how do we navigate this space in Britain? What does that look like? What do those relationships look like? So right from the start, you know, we built it on friendship and trust, not just about dialogue, but actually going deeper and really saying to the women, and we've got groups now all over the country, wherever there's a Jewish and a Muslim community, we pair them up and we have co-chairs for each local group in different parts of the country. And we've said to them, right at the heart of it, put the friendship, develop the friendship and the trust, so that when you do start to talk about the difficult things, you will have that basis on which to build it. And of course, some of the work around anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hatred is also important, crucial, but difficult. You know, the anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hatred can be similar, can also be very different. What offends people is difficult to sometimes understand from others. So all of these issues we've brought out, we've brought them together, and it has been amazing. And of course, you know, there are Muslims who are anti-Semitic. There are Jewish people who in this country who don't understand Muslims, who feel fearful, who feel that, you know, they buy into all of the ugly, horrible stereotypes that they hear about Muslims. You know, how do you then navigate some of that stuff? And it is why I feel so proud of the work, and also so really proud of those women, all of them, every single one of them, for being a leader and doing things differently and really putting that work into action in their communities, in their families, in their mosques, in their synagogues. And, you know, there's so much more that we want to do with that. And just to give you an illustration of why this stuff is important, you know, when the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting happened, I cried. I cried because, not because, and I didn't just sign a letter as a faith leader to say, I condemn what happened. I cried because I knew the kind of people that would have been in that synagogue. I've been in synagogues like that with my friends here and in America. I understood what it would have felt like when that man went in and shot people, you know, indiscriminately in the way that he did. I really felt it on my inside. I felt sick. I felt upset for them. And then similarly, the same sort of time, the mosque attack happened in New Zealand. And Lindsay, my Jewish friend, was the very, very first person to call me first thing in the morning when the news was unfolding about what was happening. And she called me to say, are you okay? I'm so sorry to hear what happened. And she then had to hear my frustration and my anger about what was happening. And I was angry because I felt like, why is everybody suddenly surprised that a crazy person has gone into a mosque and shot people dead? Why is anybody surprised when we know that the anti-Muslim sentiment and all of that was rising? Don't be shocked by it. We're not shocked as Muslims. We knew this was going to happen. You know, she had to listen to me talk about all of that stuff. And as my friend, she did a great job. And just to finish off on this point by saying, you know, even today, as recently as today, some really kind of difficult discussions happening between some of these Jewish and Muslim women based on the horrendous attacks that we saw 2 nights ago in Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. And, you know, again, people being shot as they prayed, you know, terrible, terrible scenes that look like they're coming out of a film, actually coming from real life. What do we do with that as Jews and Muslims in Britain when there's so much complexity around that whole area of the world? And it's not straightforward, but clearly that is not okay. So how do we as Jewish and Muslim women navigate these things? And these conversations literally have been happening today. And again, it requires trust and empathy and compassion, but it's not easy. And the last initiative I want to just talk about, really, I'm going to base around a hadith from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So Together We Thrive is a new social enterprise that I've set up. And I want to mention the hadith of Muhammad, peace be upon him, when he mentioned 4 women who are worthy of following. One is Mary, Maryam, mother of Jesus. The other, Khadija, his first wife. The third, Fatima, his daughter. And the fourth, Asiya, the wife of Pharaoh. May God be pleased with all of these women. And the Prophet specifically mentioned, peace be upon him, all of these women. Why? Because these are women that we can learn from. And in a way, Together We Thrive, I think sums up that hadith. I was thinking about it today. It kind of encapsulates a lot of what we're trying to do. Yes, a network of Muslim women around the UK collaborating, challenging and working together, and also looking at the rights of women in our faith teachings and looking at how they play out in reality. It's not enough to just say Islam gave rights to women 1400 years ago. I don't want to hear anybody say that. If the reality on the ground for me as a woman, for so many of us in Britain as Muslim women, is not matching up with what our faith says, that for me is not okay. And in fact, of course, all faith communities, let's all be honest about it, have serious issues around gender and leadership and faith and misogyny and how all of that plays out in people's lives and in our places of worship. And in that sense, we as women of faith actually have more in common when it comes to this bad stuff than people often like to talk about. But I love to talk about these things because I think it's very empowering for us to learn from each other. So just briefly finishing off before John rings his lovely bell, to talk about the 4 women just very briefly that were mentioned in that hadith, because it's important. And I think summarizes why I think that we as women of faith in particular have a really important role to play. And Mary, or Maryam, as we call her in Arabic, may God be pleased with her, has a whole chapter written about her named after her, in the Quran. Beautiful descriptions of her character and who she was as a person. We don't have that much detail though. We believe that as Muslims, whatever's written in the Quran is the detail that we need. But having said all of that, I believe we also have a responsibility to, and not just as women, but people, to find out more about Mary, or Maryam in this case, and her character and what she stood for and who she was. And of course, I think there's something really important here that we as Muslims and Catholics, for example, can talk about and learn from. And some of these things are difficult, of course. The understanding of Mary being the mother of Jesus, peace be upon him. What does that mean? Who was she? And how did that play out? But she's a really significant figure for us as Muslims too. And I think that we can learn respectfully together about her as just one example. May God be pleased with her. Khadija, the first wife of the Prophet, the most dear in many ways to him until she died. He was heartbroken when she died. She's a beautiful example of him and her, and a wonderful union that they had. May God be pleased with both of them. She was older than him. She proposed to him. She had money and he didn't. She supported his mission from day one, never doubted that what was happening to him was something that was meant to happen. She employed him. She proposed to him. You know, she was for sure a very powerful role model. What I would say to Muslims, though, as an extra bit of what we normally say about Khadija is, are we really creating environments and communities where some people like Khadija, may God be pleased with her, can rise and be part of our communities again? In some cases, unfortunately, I would say no. And then just very quickly finishing off so that I don't run out of time, Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet and of Khadija, we need to learn from her, learn about her life, what she was. She was very patient. She was very close to the poor and the destitute, always gave away whatever she had. Loads of things we can learn from her about how she responded when her father was ridiculed and treated badly. And last but not least, Asiya, the wife of Pharaoh, who was really living in a situation where she was living essentially and married to a tyrant. How she managed that, how she conducted herself, all of these things we can learn from. So just finishing off, you know, Together We Thrive, really focusing on developing and growing as Muslim women, challenging the misuse of our teachings, but also finding allies and partners with women of other faiths, Catholic and other women, and really challenging and looking at the patriarchal structures in our communities and how that doesn't work. And we can't just accept them. We need to challenge the status quo and very much be partners as men and women and people of different faiths. together. So just finishing, I would say that we need to go forward with action, as I say, beyond dialogue. You know, dialogue is great. I never dismiss anybody that wants to do any of this work. I know how hard it is. Even dialogue is difficult. But I would say we need to take our dialogue and really turn it into action. We are people who are proud of our country, passionate about our faith, and we need to look beyond just tolerance. We need to go through respect and coexistence and really think about how we work together for the sake of the common good. Thank you so much for listening. I spoke very fast, and John, thank you for not ringing your bell on me. Assalamu alaikum.
Judy, you nearly got the bell, but it was so interesting. Thank you so much. And I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. So if you'd like to hold on to them and put them into the chat when the speeches are finished. And I apologize, I've been having problems with sharing the screen. I don't know, you kept seeing the wrong thing on the screen, but I'm going to try again. I hope it works this time. Michael Fitzgerald is a British Cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church and an expert on Christian-Muslim relations. He has had the rank of Archbishop since 2002. At his retirement in 2012, he was the Papal Nuncio to Egypt and delegate to the Arab League. He headed the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue from 2002 to 2006. Pope Francis raised him to the rank of Cardinal on the 5th of October 2019. Your Eminence, we welcome you and look forward to your reflections, and hand over to you.
Thank you, John. I'm going to start with a reading from the Gospel of Luke, the parable of the Good Samaritan. John mentioned the letter of Pope Francis, Fratelli Tutti. His chapter 2 of that letter is all on this, a reflection on this parable. A man asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was once on his way down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of brigands. They took all he had, beat him, and then made off, leaving him half dead. Now a priest happened to be traveling down the same road, but when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. In the same way, a Levite who came to the place saw him and passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan traveler who came upon him was moved with compassion when he saw him. He went up and bandaged his wounds, pouring oil and wine on them. He then lifted him onto his own mount, carried him to the inn, and looked after him. Next day he took out 2 denarii and handed them to the innkeeper. 'Look after him,' he said, 'and on my way back I will make good any extra expense you have.' Which of these 3 do you think proved himself a neighbor to the man who fell into the brigand's hands?" "The one who took pity on him," he replied. Jesus said to him, "Go and do the same yourself." The Gospel of the Lord. So now I want to talk a bit about this document that was on human fraternity that was signed by Pope Francis and Dr. Ahmed Tayeb, the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, in Abu Dhabi on the 4th of February 2019. To my mind, it is a courageous document. It is wide-ranging, but realistic, and I think we should consider it as a work in progress. So I want to take each of these points. Courageous document. I think the 2 leaders had the courage to engage with one another. Dr. Ahmed Tayyib was the first Imam of Al-Azhar to travel to the Vatican to meet with a pope. A pope had visited Al-Azhar. Pope John Paul II went to Cairo in the year 2000 in February, and he was warmly welcomed at Al-Azhar. But Pope Francis welcomed Ahmed Tayyib, and then he accepted an invitation to go to a peace meeting, a meeting for peace organized by Al-Azhar. And he then received Ahmed Tayyib later in the same year, in 2017, in Rome with a delegation. They had lunch together, and it was during that lunch that they decided on writing a document on human fraternity. It took about 6 months to prepare, so much longer than the 6 weeks preparing the Iftar in Coventry Cathedral. It took about 6 months back and forwards between Rome and Cairo to prepare this text. And then it was signed in the Gulf, in Abu Dhabi. And Pope Francis went for that meeting, the first Pope to go to the Arabian Peninsula. And these two leaders have shown that they were ready to engage the members of their respected religions, though there is some opposition, and they wouldn't be surprised that there is opposition to this initiative. But they took the step. And they took the step to produce a very wide-ranging document. It speaks about reinforcing the bond of fundamental human rights, and it emphasizes certain.
He's got muted somehow. I think you've got muted somehow, Michael. You need to unmute.
I don't. Okay.
We lost you about a minute back.
So, I was saying it speaks about rights, but it also speaks about duties, and I think that is a very Islamic approach. Not only rights, but duties. And it upholds freedom, the freedom of belief, thought, expression, and action. It's mumarisa in the Arabic text. We don't know which is, but I'm sure that it was worked out in Arabic, because at that time, one of the private secretaries of the Pope was an Egyptian priest. And so he was able to work with Muhammad Abdul Salam, whom the Imam entrusted the drafting of this document. This document tackles the problem of extremism and evokes the need for the protection of places of worship. It calls for a culture of tolerance, and that goes beyond mere acceptance of one another. It goes beyond a laissez-faire attitude, because these two religious leaders stigmatize individualism. They are asking for a moral regeneration. And I would like to emphasize that I think this document has a theological foundation. that though it's dealing with practical matters, it is based on the conviction that we have one God who is the creator, who, as the Quranic reading this evening emphasized, we are created one and we are brothers and sisters together. So it's not just a social document, it is also theological. And there are very frequent references to God in the text. It's also all-embracing. No one is excluded. The third paragraph of the introduction refers to all persons who have faith in God and faith in human fraternity. And the conclusion invites to reconciliation and fraternity, all believers, indeed among believers and non-believers, and among all people of goodwill. So I think that that is important. This document is looking beyond just religious belonging to a more fundamental belonging to the human family as such. And as a Catholic, I would say that that is very in consonance with the teaching of the Second Vatican Council. It's a realistic document because it takes into account the world of today. It recognizes the presence of constant conflict and the injustice of inequality. There is a clear condemnation of terrorism and of extremism in all its forms, and especially of the use of religion to incite to violence and war. One could say, I don't know that this is true of Dr. Ahmed Al-Tayyib, but one could say that Pope Francis is a dreamer, dreaming of a better world. And the book, Let Us Dream, he develops his idea. But he is not living in a dream world. The analysis of the world that is given in this document is quite stark. It acknowledges progress in the fields of science, technology, medicine, industry, and welfare, especially in developed countries. But it points to moral deterioration that influences international action and a weakening of spiritual values and responsibility. Because the document is wide-ranging, there is a certain vagueness. It would need to be more closely defined, I think, sometimes. For instance, I'll just give one instance. There is the establishment of full citizenship. Well, what is exactly meant by full citizenship? That is not said in the document. It would be something that would need to discuss and then to apply. And this leads me to the last point, that this document is not, it's a small document, you see it there. It can be divided up into 42 paragraphs after the introduction. But it's a small document, but it's suggesting places where we can work together. People of our two religions, Islam and Christianity, but also together with others. It's an invitation. So, and what has encouraged me is to know that after the document was signed, it decided to institute a higher committee for human fraternity. That I would call it an application committee. This committee is to monitor the understanding of this document, which has been offered as something to be studied in schools, in universities, in different contexts. That the document says that already, but there is this committee that has been formed with a president. The co-presidents are the president of Al-Azhar University in Egypt, and the other co-president is the head of the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue in the Vatican, the Spanish Cardinal. And then Mahmoud Abdus Salam is the drafter of the document, is the Secretary General of this committee. He has produced a book on a testimony to the birth of the Human Fraternity document, the Pope and the Grand Imam, a thorny path. It wasn't easy. Now, interestingly enough, this committee includes a rabbi, Rabbi Bruce Lestig, who is a senior rabbi of the Washington Hebrew congregation. It includes an Orthodox Christian, Irina Bukova, who was the former Director General of UNESCO. It includes a Nobel Peace Laureate from Liberia, Lema Gubowe. It includes many different people. It includes the acting General Secretary of the World Council of Churches. So this committee, which is there to see that the document is not just read and then put back in a bookcase and left there, but actually studied and its points taken into account and solutions to the difficulties that are raised in the document are to be found together. As Julie Siddiqui mentioned, there is this kind of slogan that comes in this. We present this document, we declare the adoption of a culture of dialogue as the path, mutual cooperation as the code of conduct, and reciprocal understanding as the method and standard. So it's good that we should be discussing this document this evening. This is necessary, but we have to go from discussion to action as well. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much, Your Eminence. That's a wonderful summary of the document and what's happened since, which I think is very helpful. And so without more ado, I'm going to pass to our next speaker. Dr. Sheikh Mohammed Ali Shomali was born in Tehran, Iran. He studied in the religious seminaries of Qom and also completed a bachelor's and master's degree of Western philosophy from the University of Tehran. He then received his doctorate in philosophy from the University of Manchester. Sheikh Shomali currently holds a number of posts, including founder director at the International Institute for Islamic Studies in Qom, Iran, head of the Imam Khomeini's Educational Research Institute Religious Department, editor-in-chief to the Message of Thaqalain Journal and the Spiritual Quest Journal. He was the resident alim and director of the Islamic Centre of England in London from 2004 until 2019, which is where I first met him. I know that you have had a large number of fruitful dialogues with Cardinal Fitzgerald, and we look forward to your reflections. So,
thank you. Thank you, John. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, I am very delighted to be with you in this blessed day of the month of Ramadan, talking about one of the important documents of this decade, at least, if not the last 20 years of this century. And I hope and pray to God that He would guide our direction, the direction of our discussion, to where our hearts come closer and we can understand better what we can do for furthering this cause. As we heard on the 4th February 2019, Pope Francis and Dr. Ahmed Tayyib signed a very important document on human fraternity, which when you read, you would be surprised by the amount of topics that are covered and how they managed to identify some of the greatest challenges that humanity faces today. It's very, very good examination of our current situation in the world, plus what can be also solution. In May 2020, Pontifical Institute for Arabic and Islamic Studies, they published issue 45 of Islamo-Christiana, and over there are different papers on this document, and I had a paper in that issue and reflected as a Muslim and in particular from Shia perspective on this document. I just share with you few points from my paper where I just referred to major issues of this document, and then I want to carry on with some other issues. And those who are interested, they can find this paper also online. A Shia Muslim perspective on the document on human fraternity for world peace and living together. So this was published in 45 of Islamo-Christian. In the document, which is very rich and it's very, much praiseworthy that they managed to put this together despite belonging to different traditions. So they mention few important points. One is that we need to work together to establish fraternal ties and consequently love and collaboration with all human beings, especially between Christians and Muslims. In Barakats, I have had the idea that both Muslims and Christians needed to develop a more advanced theology of how to deal with each other. I think in Christianity, especially the Catholic Church, progress has been made after Second Vatican Council and in particular Nostra Aetate, but still I think there is a need for developing something specific about how to deal with Islam. And in the Muslim world also the same. We have things about, all believers or all the people of the book, for example, but we need to have a special attention to how we understand relation between Islam and Christianity and Muslim and Christians specifically. So here there is a step towards this important, I think, progress. Promote a culture of dialogue mutual recognition and respect. Of course, this is something strategic, and we need to come up with lots of plans and lots of curriculum developments, courses, etc. But we have to work on it. Spread a culture of tolerance and coexistence. We discover the values of peace, justice, goodness, and human fraternity. So they didn't neglect the issue of justice or peace because they just wanted, to talk about theological. No, they came down also to all the problems that we have on the ground. Revive the human conscience and remain grounded in religious values. Humanity would suffer more and more if religious values are compromised or ignored, or religious people feel shy to offer their contribution and just think everything has to be neutral or everything has to be just secular. 6, observe moral values, especially in international encounters, to avoid despair, isolation, and religious or atheistic extremism. It's very important. Yes, we have religious extremists, but we have also people who are not religious and they are extremists. We have people who are not religious and they are fundamentalists. So we have to be aware. Attend to the world's injustices again, safeguarding family life, which is very important. And one of the areas that the Vatican and some Muslim countries worked together was in a conference in Egypt about population and about many things about family, other things, and it was close collaboration between Vatican and some Muslim countries. Do not misuse religion by legitimizing violence in the pursuit of one's political agenda. Respect the freedom that God has granted to mankind. Respect the rights and dignity of women. Preserve the rights of children, the elderly, and people with special needs. Secure equal citizenship for all members of one's society. Protect places of worship. End all terrorist activity in the world. Form good relations between the East and the West. So as you see, it's very comprehensive and it's written with commitment to their theological backgrounds, but at the same time with the language of unity and a language of heart and mind together. So what came after this, as Cardinal Fitzgerald mentioned, in addition to the formation of a committee for furthering up, there were, last year, month of Ramadan was the day of prayer, which was also sanctioned by the Pope and Muslim, leaders. And something which I think was very important is that on the 3rd October 2020, Pope Francis in Assisi, near the home of St. Francis, he issued his letter of universal fraternity. When you read that, you find that that is very much in harmony with this document of human fraternity that he signed with Sheikh of Al-Azhar. And for me, this is very important because I realized that this is not a side attempt of the Vatican just when it comes to how to deal with Muslims. It comes from Pope's deep conviction to universal fraternity, and in every ground he tries to enhance and advance this. So I see consistency here. And I think the good experience that he had with Imam of Azhar which led to that, gave him maybe a signal that this is the path and he has to continue. And then the next important incident is his historical visit of Iraq in a very difficult time. And I heard from my friends in Rome that all advisors of the Pope were against this trip because of the risks, because of pandemic, because of maybe terrorist, risk, etc. But after lots of prayer, the Pope decided to make this trip. And it was very encouraging for us to see that there is recognition of the great work, actually similar work for universal fraternity that Grand Ayatollah Sistani was doing all these years post Saddam in Iraq. And had it not been his role and other religious leaders, but his main role, Iraq would have been in a much worse situation today. Still, it's not a perfect situation, but it could be much chaotic situation after Saddam, when there was a vacuum of power, and different groups had weapons, etc. Could lead to disaster. He tried to secure independence of Iraq. He never visited any head of a state or any foreign minister of any country, except, of course, maybe Iran or United Nations officials. And he said actually to the Pope that for several years he's not meeting any person except religious people or people who work for culture. He dedicated his power and the respect that people have for him to bring unity inside Iraq and to support not only the Shia. No, he supported everyone. He supported Sunnis and said Sunnis are not just brothers, they are ourselves. He supported Christians, he supported Yazidis. He opened the doors of Shia shrines and Shiite institutions to Christians, to Yazidis who had to flee from ISIS. So to see that there is such recognition by the Pope and Vatican to make this visit despite all the challenges, and recognition of Grand Ayatollah Sistani, who is not a man of meeting many people, to welcome the Pope in his home and having such intimate meeting that you could see how they held hands of each other, what the Pope said in the plane. So I think we are seeing some good steps taking place. From 4th of February 2019, then later October 2020, the document of the encyclical letter of Universal Fraternity, the visit to Iraq. And I am very hopeful that now that we have people like the Pope and Grand Ayatollah Sistani, who, for people who know the Muslim world, they know how influential he is and how his words are very much respected and heard. I think their meeting would facilitate for us who want to work for dialogue, and this would remain for centuries as a point of reference. And I hope this would become more common and would happen in more context with more people. But overall, we as people of faith have to be always hopeful. No matter how much we have difficulties in the world, challenges in the world, we have to be hopeful and we have to work together. As Julie mentioned, it's not just a matter of tolerance. Tolerance, I think, is too little. And unfortunately, sometimes we don't have even this tolerance. Sometimes we see even people, fight, and they want to, eradicate the other party. But in my understanding, tolerance is too little, because we are supposed not to be wolves that we need to, tolerate. We are supposed to be human beings. And for us, the most natural thing is to get acquainted with each other, to respect each other, to talk and listen to each other. So we as Muslims and Christians now, for the most part, maybe there are exceptions, but I think most of Christians, most of Muslims, they know that not only they should tolerate each other, they should respect each other, they should talk to each other. And now I think more and more Christians and Muslims are coming to this recognition that we need to work together. We need to collaborate. We are no longer, looking at each other as enemies, God forbid, or as rivals or competitors. We are getting to another paradigm, and that is where we look at each other as co-believers in God, as people who have joint responsibility to work for people of God. And we need to offer our joint testimony to the people of the world. Unfortunately, some people who are not appreciating all the great contribution of religions, they try to use the conflict between some religious people as say, look, these are religious people who are troublemakers in the world. And the world will be better off if we don't have religions. But this is wrong. And the best way to refute this is, in addition to the good work that all faith communities do on their own, is to be able to show to them also the good work that we do together. We have to show them that you can be very deeply rooted in your tradition. You can be very strong in your own faith, but this strength would just make you open. I think those who are not open or closed are actually very fragile from inside. They are very fearful from inside. They are weak inside. We need to show that depth and strength in your tradition would make you happy to work with people from other religious traditions, and we together demonstrate our unity to other people. I am thinking that we are seeing that thanks to God and thanks to the people who try to humbly listen to God, these are being one after the other happening. Just it is our role to recognize where we can stand, where we can help, or at least not be an obstacle for this push, soft push of God, humanity towards universal fraternity. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sheikh Shomali. It's really interesting, and especially what you said about Iraq. I think that's very, very helpful. So without any more ado, we pass to our last guest, who's waited so patiently. Kevin McDonald is the Archbishop Hemaritis of the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Southwark. He became the secretary of the Pontifical Council promoting Christian unity in Rome in 1985. In 1993, he returned to England and became the parish priest of English Martyrs Sparkhill until 1998. It was while in Sparkhill that he developed his interest in interreligious dialogue. This continued during his time as Bishop of Northampton and then as Archbishop of Southwark. In fact, you have continued this in retirement, and we have met on several occasions. So it is a great pleasure to welcome you, and we look forward to your reflections.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you hear me now? Okay. I thought it might be interesting to try and contextualize from a Catholic point of view this document, the agreed document on human fraternity. And I'll do that. So, because it doesn't come from nowhere, I think it's important to realise that it has a context. The first thing to say is that the need for leadership in this area is very obvious. The divisions and inequalities within the human community are too evident to ignore, and they have been brutally exposed by the present pandemic. The need for human unity and human community has never been clearer. Of course, there have been voices affirming the need for unity in the human family for a long time, including within the church. And in fact, the main thing I'd want to say is that in the writings of Pope Francis, including Fratelli Tutti, which we've all just heard about, have actually been part of a process of a deeper understanding on the part of the church of what the nature of the church is. But before talking more about that, I want to refer to something said by Thomas Merton. Thomas Merton was an American monk and one of the most important spiritual writers of the Catholic spiritual writers of the last century. He famously said something which seems to me to get to the heart of the idea of human fraternity. He was a monk. He'd been living in a monastery in Kentucky for years, living in silence and in prayer. But one day he needed to go into town, and suddenly he was surrounded by huge numbers of people, which was an incredible shock for him. And when he wrote about this experience in Louisville, Kentucky, he said this: in Louisville, at the corner of 4th and Walnut, in the center of the shopping district, I was suddenly overwhelmed with the realization that I loved all these people, that they were mine and I theirs, and that we could not be alien to one another, even though we were total strangers. This realization of profound connection came after years of prayerful seclusion in a monastery. And I'm sure that it was precisely that experience of prayer that gave him clarity and conviction about the connection among all people, because not everybody does see themselves as connected with others. In Catholic theology, we acknowledge the action of the Holy Spirit outside the bounds of the church, and the word that we use for that connection is the word communion, which means, from a Greek word koinonia, shared participation in a given reality. And in Christian theology, it's come to refer to our shared participation in the Holy Spirit. And Merton realized that we are all basically within God's action, within God's care, within relationship with God. And that is when he realized that he understood fraternity. My point here is simply that the idea of fraternity has a spiritual and theological background, and the context which we may express in different ways. I also, mention's been made of other things the Pope has said. I think it's useful just to look back. People mentioned the Second Vatican Council, to some of the things. I think there's a build-up to this. It's part of a process of self-discovery by the Church, a process of deeper understanding. In Paul VI's encyclical Ecclesiam Suam in 1964, there was a step change. Without compromising the claims of the Catholic Church, the encyclical affirmed the inherent connection of the Church with those beyond its bounds. And it was non-adversarial in tone. It used the image of concentric circles. It affirmed the connection of the Catholic Church with the Eastern Church and with the Jews and the Muslims and people of other religions, recognize that we are actually connected. That was written during the Second Vatican Council, and its implications took the idea of communion, belonging together, to a new level. And in churches' relations with other Christians, it came to be talked about in terms of degrees of communion. Mention was made a moment ago about Assisi, and I think it's important to recall that Pope John Paul II in '86 convened a day of prayer for peace in Assisi with other Christians and members of other religions, inviting them to pray for peace. So there's a background to that's what I'm saying. This hasn't come from nowhere. This is part of a process. On that occasion, the Christians prayed together while members of other religions prayed in their own way. And the Pope positively affirmed the members of other religions in their prayer. Later on, in one of his encyclicals, he affirmed the unique position of the Catholic Church within God's purposes, while also affirming the action of the Holy Spirit beyond its bounds. The point is that faith in the Holy Spirit, active in the world and in the community, provided a clear theological basis for the idea of fraternity as developed and explored by Pope Francis. So human fraternity is a gift of God. That's the point. It's a gift of God, and it's a gift and a responsibility as well. So turning now to Pope Francis himself, in his encyclical Laudato Si, he took this idea of communion to yet another level by affirming and exploring the relationship between the human community and the whole of creation. This is very important. It's our world. The world is God's gifts. It's something we share, given to us to nurture, sustain, and sustain together. That's the context for human fraternity. We belong to this one world. And he quotes the ecumenical patriarch Bartholomew: as Christians, we are called to accept the world as a sacrament of communion, a way of sharing with God and our neighbors on a global scale. And Pope Francis himself says, the created things of this world are not free of ownership, for they are yours, Lord, who love all the living. This is the basis for our conviction that as part of the universe called into being by one Father, all of us are linked by unseen bonds and together form a universal family, a sublime communion, which fills us with a sacred, affectionate and humble respect. So we belong together because we belong to the world, because we're in creation. So we're therefore linked by bonds of communion, and fundamental to this is our shared participation in God's gifts, and crucially the gift of creation. Our fraternity is reality. That is our reality. That's who and what we are. We exist for fraternity. And that was what Merton understood in Louisville. The point I want to make, of course, is that the joint declaration on fraternity by Pope Francis and Al-Tayeb is both a statement of Catholic belief and a critically important gesture of goodwill and brotherhood. Finally, I want to say something about the importance and significance of this statement. And what particularly interests me is not simply the importance for religions, but its importance for all humanity. The document affirms the equality of all people. It also makes it clear that the diversity and pluralism of religion, color, race, sex, and language are within God's providence. So what's the secular world, the unbelieving world, making of this? We've talked about the importance of it for religious people. And in the New Statesman last October, Adrian Pabst, a political scientist and a professor of politics at the University of Kent, wrote a piece entitled, "What Can the Left left learn from Pope Francis? The New Statesman is, of course, a left-leaning political and cultural weekly, which Rowan Williams regularly contributes to, though religion does not figure in the preoccupations of most of its writers or correspondents, but perhaps makes the point that Pope Francis is saying things that everyone needs to hear, religious or not. And what he says about politics today, he says this: missing from progressive politics is a sense of purpose beyond rights and utility, a vision of humanity flourishing, anchored in fraternity and friendship. The contemporary left, I think he mean all, and then it is true of many political people, lacks a distinctive conception of the good life. Of the three foundational values that have dominated politics since the French Revolution, that's liberty, equality, and fraternity, politicians have privileged the first two at the expense of the third. Yet without fraternity, liberty slides into individualistic free choice, removed from relational constraints of family and community. It seems clear to me that Pope Francis is speaking into a vacuum in the political culture of our day, whether it's on the left or the right. Perhaps is concerned that fraternity, true brotherhood among people, is seen as something that governments can deliver in a top-down kind of way. We just have these elections. Everybody's saying, what are they going to deliver? That's the great word. But that's not the vision of Pope Francis at all. For him, it is communities, not governments, that are the wellspring of fraternity. And Adrian Pabst also sees the development of extreme identity politics, where politics is driven by single issues, whether race, gender, sexual orientation, and so on, as very often causing division and undermining the growth of grassroots fraternity, when you're focused totally on your issues, the issue that are your priority. That does not create fraternity. He says the combination of identity politics and the free market simply exacerbates divisions. And very interestingly, he sees the modern obsession with technology as creating a world of connection, which is actually artificial. Are we connected? Are we more fraternal because of the internet and so on? There's the potential for it, but does it actually facilitate it, or does it in fact in some ways do the opposite? To recover a moral compass, politicians should heed Pope Francis's call for a new vision of fraternity and social friendship. Fraternity is a universal disposition. We should love every human being because we all have dignity. So the key point here seems to me that any particular issues that we may have, as I said a moment ago, need to be seen in the wider perspective of human fraternity, a perspective that doesn't favor one issue in a way that undermines other issues. A final point, and this is very important, is that our fraternity must be global, not limited to one continent, one country, one tribe, or one race. During the pandemic, sometimes on the news, you feel there's an obsession with local issues, with British issues, and only occasional reference to serious situations in Yemen, in India, and so on and so forth. I think we must think globally. Our sense of fraternity must be global. And it's interesting that Pope Francis visits and places that people surprise people. He goes to places that people wouldn't expect him to go. Finally, though, perhaps the most important of all is that the idea of fraternity shifts the focus away from me and my issues. That's the important point. This is not to say that my issues are not important, but they are part of a bigger picture, a bigger story that includes us all, and that's the story of human fraternity. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Archbishop Kevin. I think you gave it a wonderful context, and also bringing in the secular element is so important. So thank you very much for that. I'd like to thank all the 4 speakers at this point, because I think it's been a most stimulating evening, and I'm sure there's lots of questions. I've spotted several in the chat already. What I propose now is that we have a comfort break. Our friend from Citizens UK, Safaraz Jaraz, has to